Seriously, none of you remember this guy? The police found him, lying in the kitchen. He was dead, and lying in a puddle of blood, which was not his own. The tall man with the glasses shone a flashlight upon the stone and saw, atop the monolith, a single name in arcane letters of the ancient mimicry. It was a dull and fading name of Virgil. It was preordained who would go inside the mausoleum and who would remain on guard duty outside. Kevin, whose suggested plans always tended to be forced upon the others, had selected Roger to wait outside with the taller of the two women. He wanted the more serious-minded Charlie inside with him and Lisa. In accordance with his plans, Charlie pulled a crowbar out from his bag and braced it against the door of the mausoleum, slowly twisting the metal handle with a wrenching sound until there was a clicking snap and the lock broke. The chain dropped away as the door swung ajar, allowing Charlie to hold it for his companions. A moment later, there was a slight squeal and then a thudding sound, leaving only two people standing in the cold night outside the door. Roger furrowed his brow for a moment as if in consideration of something, took a breath, held it, and then proposed his quandary. "Hey, Jess," he asked. "Why'd you close the door on them?" "I think they pulled it shut when they went in," she answered him, absent-mindedly glancing around at the stillness of the slabs that stood in neat rows before them. She got the feeling that the tombstones were watching them, waiting for something, row upon row sitting as if in a church, and she and Roger were meant to be the ministers, or the entertainment. She shivered as one tombstone in particular seemed to be staring intently. For a moment, she could have sworn it moved a little closer to her. "I think the lantern will work better in here," Kevin said, snapping his fingers. Following the thinly veiled order, Charlie reached into his pack and pulled out a battery-powered lantern. He flicked the switch, and it seemed to fill the tomb with a hazy orange glow, illuminating the great empty hallway in which they stood. To either side rose high walls covered in squares that were all identical, 18 inches high by 3 feet wide. There were no visible handles, only the protruding rectangles indicating where too many bodies had been laid on slabs and buried in the walls. Down near the floor, the rectangles became larger squares, and Charlie couldn't tell what the reason or the difference was, so in his usual manner, he posed the question. "Maybe it's where they store all the urns," Lisa proposed. "You know, for the people who were cremated." "That's a possibility, as disorganized as it may seem," Kevin said, only half paying attention as his eyes skimmed from block to block. "Or maybe it's just where they store all the fatties," Charlie suggested. "You know, the people who were a little too much girth to fit in a normal vault." "Or perhaps it was only their wallets that were fat," Kevin said. He turned his nose down at the others, and his glasses fell forward an inch, pushed them back up to the bridge of his nose. "He who has the gold gets the greater burial chamber. The modern-day pharaohs, you could say. Hey, which one of you closed the door?" The other two shook their heads and slumped their shoulders almost in unison. Kevin sighed. "Must have been those idiots outside. Trust me, come morning, we don't want to be found in here. We have some very upset police officers bearing down on us. And that would run counter to our cause. Before he had a chance to continue, there was a great boom from outside the tomb, as if a bolt of lightning had struck the door itself. Scarcely a moment later, and they heard the steady pounding of a torrential downpour, and they all smelled the familiar mist of a thunderous rain. More booms and thunderclaps shook the wall, and a flash of lightning shone in through the great glass room of the mausoleum, temporarily drowning out the light of their little lantern. This was accompanied by one final crack, the patter of more heavy rain, and then the sound receded to a moderate pitter-patter. "Are you guys okay out there?" Charlie called to Roger and Jess, but he doubted they could hear him over the astonishingly rapid thunderstorm. "If those idiots want to get drenched rather than come inside, then leave them be," Kevin said, returning his gaze to the brass nameplates mounted on each of the protruding rectangles. "Come on, 6 eyes are better than 2. And I forgot where I'd seen it. Help me find..." He was then interrupted again, only this time the thunderclap was much closer, almost as if the ground on which they stood had been supercharged to igniting it. It shook like a violent earthquake, causing Lisa and Charlie to lose their footing and collapse to the ground. Kevin grabbed the nearest berth and held himself upright, but his legs felt like a pair of noodles trying to stand in a violently quaking frying pan. He heard the sound of something shifting near the door, the unmistakable sound of something hard striking the door. And then, the quaking stopped. "What the hell was that?" Charlie asked. "Was that an earthquake, or was it the storm?" "Coincidence would suggest both, though I have my doubts," Kevin responded. "Go check on the others, will you?" Charlie and Lisa went to go and push open the door, but while the door handle turned easily, the door wouldn't open more than half an inch before it stopped completely. Charlie pushed harder and then turned to closing the door and trying to force it more rapidly. After the small distance, it would make a hard smacking sound and stop. "I think there's something blocking the door," he said at last. "There's something on the other side. Hey, Roger, Jess, can you hear me?" "Roger, Jess, are you there?" Lisa yelled in a quaky voice. "Jess, honey, answer if you can hear me." There was silence. "Roger, quit messing around and open the door." Growing increasingly impatient, Charlie began forcing himself against the door with his shoulder, backing up a few feet and then ramming it over and over. There was a crack at one point, but not from the door, and he fell backward with a cry of alarm. Lisa held him by his arm, and Kevin could see in the orange light that he was wincing in pain. She cradled his arm like a nursemaid, but Kevin only gritted his teeth in frustration. Then, looked around some more. When at last his agitation overtook him, he raised his hands to the others. The quake probably shook something loose, and it fell in front of the door. And it must be muffling the sound so they can't hear us and we can't hear them. So I suggest that we get what we came for and find another way out. Trust me, none of us want to be here once dawn arrives. Outside, Jess and Roger waited patiently until the thunder began to crackle overhead. Great bolts lit up the sky, shaking loose mighty chords of deep resonance that they could feel in their bones. But it was a dry storm, luckily, and so neither of them were forced inside due to the rain. Lightning arced and cracked across the sky like the veins of some great behemoth mostly hidden in the clouds, and Jess instinctively found herself huddling slightly closer to Roger. It was the quake that separated them, though they couldn't see it. It was as if the bolt of lightning had struck the ground nearby, causing the earth to explode and shake violently, forcing the two of them to stumble off the stone steps of the mausoleum and onto the cold dirt and grasping grass. The violence of the quake was overshadowed by the rumbling roar as the dirt of the cemetery started falling away into some hideously erupting chasm spreading out from the very steps of the tomb. Dirt and grass fell down into nothingness, and the gaping maw grew wider, stretching 3, 4, 5 feet across and snaking its way down amongst the tombstones, some of which fell away from their silent pews and into the black void. Jess and Roger scrambled to get away from the widening fault and realized only too late that they were on the opposite sides of it. It was Jess who noticed that it seemed to stop mere inches away from the steps of the tomb, as if the chasm was some inverted red carpet that twisted and curved its way to the closed door. Why haven't they come outside? She found herself asking, but that thought was quickly crowded out by more pertinent need to reconnect with Roger. "Hey, Raj, I don't think we should risk jumping it," she called into the sudden quietude of the night. She didn't realize until she began to speak just how silent things had become. "I wasn't dreaming of it," Roger responded as he inched closer to the line and glanced down. He couldn't see anything in the blackness below. "Why don't we meet on the other side of the mausoleum?" She gave him a thumbs up and began jogging to her right around the crypt. As she did so, she began to grow nervous, seeing all the tombstones that still encircled the mausoleum. It was like it was the center of some grand show, and all these identical tombstones were just waiting for it to begin. She quickened her pace, but the end of the mausoleum seemed to almost never come. She didn't realize just how big the structure was until she tried to go around it. And when she paused to recalibrate her bearings, she then noticed the growing blackness that was following in the form of some otherworldly fog. The edge of the fault was still just barely inside, and she could see that it was the source of the strange black mist rising from the earth itself, as if it had become some bizarre fog machine. Soon enveloped her, choking out even the light of her electric torch, and she started to stumble. She moved over to the mausoleum and put one hand against its cold stone, using it to guide herself around its perimeter, moving far slower than she originally hoped. Up ahead, she saw motion and imagined it to be Roger, but as it came closer, she didn't recognize the strange gait at which it loped, as if one of its legs had been twisted beyond repair and left it piteously limping. It was hunched over, and she could make out a contorted back that rose up nearly on level with its head, and it reached out with disproportionate arms that nearly touched the ground, with enormous hands and long, thin fingers that trailed off into nothingness. Without a moment's hesitation, Jess let go of the mausoleum and turned towards the tombstones, which stared at her with cold placidity, as she tried desperately to distance herself from the thing, which clearly wasn't Roger. Kevin grunted as he pulled another one of the small rectangles out a few inches. The caskets were closed, yes, but luckily not locked, or his plan wouldn't be possible. Charlie stood on the edge of the casket below, one hand holding the edge of the casket, while his other hand was pressed into Kevin's back, holding him steady as he balanced. 10 feet below, Lisa watched the two of them, her flashlight trained on their position. Kevin stopped for a moment, gripped the casket that he just pulled out, and used his other hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead before it had a chance to drip onto his glasses or into his eyes. It had been Lisa's idea, to Kevin's dismay, and he couldn't deny the logic of it. Over the course of 10 minutes, they began pulling out one casket after another, each only about 3 or 4 inches, enough to get a grip or foothold, but not enough to release too much of the odor they expected from the bodies which called these shelves their beds, forming a makeshift stepladder going up towards the glass ceiling of the mausoleum. Kevin was quickly growing exhausted, but he knew that he was the only one of the trio who was physically capable of pulling the stone and metal slabs from their resting places. There were only 4 more slabs to pull out, and they'd reach the ceiling. Once this work was finished, he could relocate their goal, and then the 3 of them could climb out and be rid of this silent space. There was a momentary flash of darkness, and Kevin nearly lost his footing. "The light, Lisa, please!" Kevin yelled down, and a second later the light was back up and blinding him. He grunted in agitation, and the light dropped to his chest, allowing him to see once again. Lisa apologized, then glanced over to her right. "I was just wondering." "Spit it out, Lisa," Kevin ordered after she trailed off. "Well, why did we open the one down that way?" she asked. "What?" Kevin asked. "The box down that way," Lisa motioned with the light again. Kevin followed the beam and saw that one of the larger crypts down on the floor about 15 feet from where Lisa stood was wide open. "Why did you open that one? Is that the one that we're looking for? What makes you think I opened it?" Kevin asked, his voice falling uncharacteristically soft. But even as he posed the question, he realized it couldn't have been either of the others, for Lisa wasn't strong enough and Charlie's arm was too twisted. "I thought you opened it while she was helping me with my arm," Charlie muttered. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if pensively considering what to do. After a moment, he began to climb back down to the ground. "Let me take a look." Without a second glance, he passed by Lisa and crouched down beside the stone slab that had been slid sideways. This struck him momentarily as odd, considering the rest of the crypts opened outward rather than sliding sideways. He then realized that the entire opening had been broken free, and the cracked slab was leaning against the casket to the left of it. "Hey Lisa, can I have your flashlight?" Charlie asked. "I think I see something in..." Before he could finish the thought, something sprang to life inside the rectangular hole. Lisa instinctively stepped back in surprise at the sound, and she saw just enough in the quivering, wavering beam of her torch to make out something long and thin and black reaching out from the crypt. No, it wasn't just one tendril, but a series of them, 3, 4, 5 hard and spindly limbs emerging from the darkness, each immensely long and impossibly thin. Insectoid. And they seemed to spin like the blades of a blender. The end of each limb pierced Charlie's flesh along with his face, his shoulders, his arms, and his stomach, causing him to scream as they retracted back into the confines of the crypt, dragging him inward. There was nothing Lisa could do but shine the light in that direction, and the light was almost blinding as it reflected off the first shimmering black limbs and then metallic streaks and splatter of a deep crimson that were sprayed on the adjacent tombs. It was as if a garden hose had whipped loose and began spraying red wine across the stone. Lisa let out a shrieking screech and stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. Its orange glow cast itself at odd angles, creating and emphasizing bizarre shapes amongst the shadows of the crypt. She backed towards the wall and almost tripped on her own ankles, but managed to regain her footing. Above her, Kevin struggled to stifle his own cry of alarm, but neither of the two could outdo the howls from Charlie, whose cries and gurgling hacks came out as incomprehensible. Mustering her last ounce of morbid courage, Lisa shined the flashlight on the place where Charlie had been, but he was no longer there. His screams were abruptly halted in tune with a guttural yell, somehow chittering, gnashing sound, and a spray of red and streaky pink sprayed out from the hole. Her light dropped to the new puddle, and she could see patches of raw flesh floating in pools of scarlet. More sprayed from the hole, and this time the messiness of the thing within was visible. She saw a finger, an ear, a bit of scalp, and part of a foot sliding to a stop across a stained stone. And from the deep recesses of the hole in the wall, those insectoid tendrils were, again, beginning to emerge, scraping across the polished marble as a high clicking sound became muffled by the shifting of some great girth within. "Lisa, up here!" Kevin cried out as Lisa grabbed the nearest pulled-out casket, her feet sliding on the one below as she pulled herself from the ground. Up above her, Kevin was furiously reaching for more of the caskets and pulling them out, working his way towards the ceiling and their only means of escape. Lisa scrambled from one crypt to the next, hoping desperately that none of these held things like the shuffling, clicking thing below. She shook her head, trying to ignore the realization that whatever it had never been human. It was something wholly different. As she grabbed one casket, she lost her grip on the flashlight and it tumbled down, shattering on the stone below and winking out. Only the pale orange of the overturned lantern could show them the path which Kevin was rapidly finishing, and that left her with an eerie impression of dark hues in the hollowed halls, where they should never have been. "Climb, Lisa! Faster!" Kevin's tense voice echoed from above her. The orange light was blotted out, and she glanced down to see the great mass on far too many legs had crawled over it, leaving them in near darkness. And in that darkness, only the sound of 3 pairs of legs could be heard scrambling from the glass ceiling, which was now their only escape. Kevin reached the ceiling and pressed his hands desperately against the glass. To his relief and astonishment, the glass opened rather like a door or an unlatched window, and he was able to scramble out onto the cold and dirty roof of the mausoleum, not taking a moment to rest. He regained his balance and then scrambled back to the opening, throwing both his arms down to grab Lisa. Past her shoulders, he could see the horrible chittering thing below beginning to twist and thin out. It took him only a second to realize that the thing wasn't changing shape. It was changing perspective. It had braced itself against the wall and started climbing up after him, never losing pace, never slowing down, but angrily tearing caskets from the wall as it passed them. His heart sank as he realized that it was climbing faster than Lisa was, and so he grabbed her by the elbows and started dragging her out through the hole. Lisa cried out as something held her left ankle, and for a terrified second, she thought the hungry thing had caught her. She imagined the severed shreds of poor Charlie smeared across her pants and shoes as the gnashing teeth of the thing bit into her. But that wasn't the sensation that assailed her. Instead, it was like something had a grip on her foot and was holding her fast. Kevin grunted and pulled, and something tore as Lisa slid upward and started through the hole. He grabbed her under the armpits and dragged her the rest of the way, and she fell onto the rough, unpolished stone of the mausoleum's roof. A second later, she glanced down at her left foot and began to scream. There was a severed hand, firmly attached around her ankle. Its skin was leathery and gray, or so it appeared in the dark gloom which oppressed them. It ended in the middle of the wrist, where the blackened bone and frayed flesh dangled disconnectedly. A piece of cloth was still attached to part of it, sunken into the rotted, shriveled skin that terminated in gangly, broken fingernails. It was those fingernails which were digging into the cuffs of her pants, tearing jagged holes. Without thinking, Kevin stomped on the hand and it slid out from around Lisa's ankle. Holding his breath, he grabbed the limb and made to throw it back into the open hole of the glass skylight, where that thing below would likely gobble it up to some terrible glee. But before he let go, he noticed the twinge of motion from his hand, the flicker of muscular contraction as it brushed his skin. He let go and it vanished into the blackness of the hole. Together, he and Lisa closed the skylight, and Lisa held it firm while Kevin went to grab the nearest ugly gargoyle which lined the roof. Luckily, it wasn't attached, having been held in place by its own weight. He then dragged it over to the glass, leaning it against the side opposite of the bronze hinge in such a way that it wouldn't break the glass, but neither would it allow the glass to move. There was a thud as darkness hit the other side of the glass and began to spread out across the surface like some pitch-black fog. Yet it stayed on the other side, and the horrified Kevin and Lisa backed away slowly.